Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. The eyes of the world have been firmly focused on China as leaders from across the globe gathered for the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation meeting in Tianjin and then moved on to Beijing for a huge military parade to mark 80 years since the end of the Second World War. So what have we learned from this week's events, and what might President Xi Jinping's global governance initiative mean for the future? With me now in Shanghai is Josef Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. And here in the studio, political commentator and author of When China Rules the World, Martin Jacques. Thank you both for coming on the agenda. Martin, let's start with you. I wonder what you think that this showcase, this military showcase we've seen, says about the image that China is projecting to the rest of the world.
I think China wants to convey an image of strength, of self-confidence, of a rival on the big stage in the world, and it wants to display the sheer modernity of China's armed forces. I don't think it's trying to make a military statement in the typical sense of the term. I think in the context of what was a terrible war, which was being commemorated, when China, one of the reasons China had such a bad time was pulverized, was because it was very backward and Japan was very advanced. So there's lots of juxtapositions going on which help to give this event its meaning in China.
So let's talk a bit more about that meaning, Joseph, because in his speech at the parade, President Xi Jinping says that humanity faces a choice between peace and war, dialogue or confrontation, win-win or zero-sum games. What's your take on that?
Well, let me begin, Juliet, by saying thanks for having me on the program and saying hello to my old friend Martin, who I haven't seen, I think, since Guangzhou last year. To answer your question, let's begin with viewing the commemoration in tandem with the SCO Plus summit we just saw in Tianjin. Two bookends, perhaps. One primarily beckoning peaceful development, win-win solutions, equitable global governance, and a secure Asia. The other, remembering the past, but also projecting tremendous power and military capacity, a stark warning to those who may want to repeat the mistakes of history and travel the road of war. They will surely be the worst of it, or worse for it. Now, with these two different points emphasized, I think a line has been drawn in time. History wasn't only remembered, it was also made. And we may have, I think we may recall this week as a key moment when what we call the Asian century became greater than Asia. It became something truly global, not only signaling the end of 500 years of Western domination, but also signaling the possibility of true alternatives for more peaceful and perhaps shared future for the 500 years to come.
Martin, do you agree with that during this line in time? Because it was a huge show of military capabilities, but I wonder what you think was China's underlying goal.
I agree very much with what Joseph said. I think that we'll remember this extraordinary juxtaposition of these two events long into the future because of the moment it came. The moment it came was, on the one hand, America's assertion of America first, doing it alone, and a veiled threat of force, expansion into this country and that country and so on the one hand. And on the other hand, China saying at the SCO conference, look, we share the platform with all these other countries. Look at our relationship with India. Look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia and so on. And so you had being displayed in Shanghai an extraordinary cross-section of humanity, but it wasn't Western-centric. It was happening in China. And I think that that was saying something very important we are in the passage from one era to another era, from the old era, represented by America, to the new era, represented by China and the global south.
Joseph, do you agree with that, that there's this new passage? I mean, at the SCO conference, President Xi talked about this new global governance initiative, and I wonder how you see that challenging existing pretty much Western-led governance networks.
Well, you know, I don't want to remark on how old Martin is, except to say that I read his book when I was in graduate school, and I've been agreeing with him for a very, very long time. But to answer your question, first, you know, President Xi has made governance one of the key words of his generation of leadership, and we've seen, of course, China making tremendous progress in self-improvements, including leveraging new technologies, such that I think Chinese governance can fairly assert itself as a gold standard for others to study and perhaps emulate. Now, I know some people will hear me say this and will be incredulous, and I know people, you know, have been subjected to all sorts of anti-China propaganda, and maybe they're cynical or ethnocentric, and they can't imagine that China has moved ahead. But please, you know, come visit us in China and see for yourself. And with that firsthand perspective, compare what we do here with what you do wherever you're from and draw your own conclusions. Second, you know, China has played essential roles in articulating a principles-based foreign policy that upholds the 5 principles of coexistence, that remains fundamentally committed to multilateralism, and promotes a more equitable, multipolar world. It's demonstrated these values in practice, not only sustaining key institutions and agreements like the UN, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the Paris Agreement, and so on. It's not only increased funding to offset Trump's abandonments, it's also made innovations. It's made these available for others. You know, advancing green transformations worldwide, for narrowing the digital divide in the global south, disseminating vaccines during the pandemic, and so on, while also advancing win-win development through the Belt Road Initiative, becoming one of the biggest drivers of growth in the global south, and putting all these abilities, tools, and wisdom to work in the SCO and BRICS, and how it interacts with others, including ASEAN, such that it's developed both the theory and the practice, as well as the means for improving global governance. And it's already, again, implemented these abilities, which now provide models for governance reforms in other multilateral organizations.
Let's pick up on some of the things that Joseph just mentioned there, Martin, about the power of the global south, because there was an impressive roll call of leaders at SCO, but also at the military parade. And I wonder what, I mean, you mentioned India, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. What do you think that says about the growing influence and importance of the global south?
Well, I think, first of all, we should look at the SCO conference as a huge gathering of much of the world. The only absentee was the West. And I think that suddenly looks almost, well, it's not yet obvious that should be the case, but it is a really striking feature when you look at the sheer representativity. And the point is that what's happening is that the world is in the process of being reconstituted on the basis of the relationship between China and the global south, home between them to, you know, something like 85% of the world's population. So who speaks for the world in a situation like that? I think the SCO conference was a dramatic illustration of this. And a particular feature of it, which I think is extremely important, was the presence of India in the way that it was there, the relationship between Xi and Modi, because the relationship between China and India has been problematic. It hasn't been easy. There has been elements of friction. There was India looking to some extent to the United States. But it looks as if that's been brought to an end by Trump. And I think that if China and India can develop their relationship between them, 38% of the world's population, if they can continue to develop their relationship, that will be very, very important indeed for the future of global governance, because between them, we're talking about such a sizable part of the world. So I think what we've seen, is actually, to be quite honest with you, tomorrow. That's what we're seeing this last weekend. That's why it's so extraordinary to get these two very different events representing two extraordinary strengths of China and the global South.
Yeah. And Joseph, I can see you nodding along there. I mean, this was the first visit to China by India Prime Minister Narendra Modi for 7 years. There were lots of quite important bilateral meetings going on during this week on the fringes of the SCO and of the commemorations. What's your take?
Well, this is where I'm going to, I agree substantially with Martin on the points that he just made, but I will, I think, deviate just a little bit. In my conversations with Indian diplomats and others, we anticipated a breakthrough earlier, last year even, but definitely in May of this year, only to be delayed briefly by the foolishness between India and Pakistan starting in late April, which Trump then claimed to have pacified, while the U.S.-controlled IMF gave Pakistan more than $1 billion to avoid defaults. That, to me, is certainly interesting in terms of timing, and I think it was ultimately also very upsetting to New Delhi. In fact, many pieces of China-India reconciliation have been in motion over the past 2 years, and as I've argued elsewhere, including I think yesterday, if I remember correctly, it was CNN's India channel. I believe China and India moving together now is not just because some bully in the White House was aggressive and disrespectful, although Indian commentators have certainly played this up, perhaps in part to encourage Hindu nationalists to change their minds on China. Rather, it's because it's in the fundamental interest of both countries to do so, and they feel comfortable enough with their respective strategic positions and commitments to take these steps. But, to draw a parallel, let's recall, the old American school book history lesson of why the U.S. entered World War I on the side of the Allies, because we were taught Germany sank the Lusitania and sent the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico. And yet, why did Germany do this? This is the part they never teach. Because it had already determined the U.S. was going to enter a fight against them regardless. And thus, they might as well do what they could to slow that down, even if those actions would then be used by the U.S. as justification for going to war. Now, I think what we may be seeing today is the U.S. realizing, as many of us here in China have realized over the past year, that China and India will move forward together regardless. And so I think Washington understands that there's no reason to hold back against India, but to instead extract as much value as they can while they still can.
Martin, I'd like to pick up on something you said before about it being, well, the West being conspicuous in their absence. Of course, Trump and the United States were not invited to the military parade, although it hasn't held the US president back from posting online during the parade saying that China was conspiring against the United States. Probably not a news flash, but what would you say that the message is from China to the United States?
I think there's a double message. I think the first message is that we represent, the global South represents an extraordinary cross-section of humanity. We're getting on very well. It's a win-win relationship, and we are thoroughly committed to cooperation and dialogue. And the second part of the message is, and look, don't mess around with us. We're very strong. We've got a great military capacity. If you do something, you can be damaged. So be warned. And I think that's always an important message for an American leader.
So let's talk a bit more about those reflections on the past. So how do you think the world views China's role in history, Martin, in terms of the history of World War II? Do you think events like this are going to help make sure that its part in global affairs is not forgotten by the rest of the world?
Well, I think that my starting point would be that the West is extremely ignorant of China's role in the last war. I mean, it's always treated the Sino-Japanese War as a sidebar. It's not recognized it as part of the Second World War, when clearly it is part of that war from 1931 to 1945. So I think that for a lot of people in the West, when they're seeing that and they're hearing that, and the sacrifices that China made, then they're probably hearing it or acknowledging it for the first time. Now, how much they take on board of that, you know, these things tend to be a bit transient in people's minds. But I think that it is important that they recognize the kind of sacrifices China made in the fight against fascism in this huge, important period. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, China lost 15 million people, 15 to 20 million people. The Soviet Union lost 20 to 25 million people. America lost 400,000. Britain lost about the same. France lost about the same. I mean, the level of sacrifice of these countries was extraordinary. And yet, I would guess, more or less, the Western population, the great majority, are ignorant of these facts.
And so events like this are a part way to changing that perception.
They have an educative function.
Yeah. Joseph, of course, this year marks not only the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, but it also marks the birth of institutions like the United Nations. Now, President Xi made it clear that China remains a trusted partner when he met the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres last week. How do you think that might help reinforce China's role in the world?
Well, you know, the vestiges of the unipolar world are eroding at speed, already substantially displaced by a multipolar reality. So, you know, this is something I think we said earlier. We can say that we're still in a period of transition, but in fact, the world is already truly multipolar. The question is whether or not this multipolar reality has been sufficiently consolidated, and the answer is not yet. The U.S. is still trying to play the spoiler, still trying to assert itself unilaterally, still trying to exploit the dollar and its outsized influence over the global financial system to extract value. Now, there are those who believe we'll continue to see considerable risks up to 2030, possibly currency wars, or even the possibility of a so-called Q day, when quantum computing abilities may reach anticipated breakthroughs, being able to mow through encryption and poorly maintained systems at breakneck speed, all of which, you know, might be taking place in the U.S. against the backdrop of what will then be Trump's failed domestic and foreign policies, and likely an even more highly polarized and desperate American electorate, either fighting with itself or wanting to fight with others.
Martin, this has been a vital week for China. As it all sinks in, I know you said it's a window on tomorrow, but what do you think that the main takeaways will be at home and abroad?
At home, well, in China, yeah. I think this will have given the Chinese people a great sense of confidence, pride, hope, and the journey they're on, they can feel very tangibly the progress that is being made by the country. I mean, that is fantastic for people, isn't it? I think abroad it depends where you are. I mean, if we're talking about the West, I think it'll have different effects. But I think, you know, that these two recent events have given the West pause for thought. You know, if you go back 2 or 3 years, then we were in a sort of Cold War atmosphere, and there was a lot of xenophobic criticisms, remarks, propaganda, and so on. And it's not quite like that now. It seems to me we've come out of that. There's a sort of understanding that actually that reaction was a desire just to reject. And what people can see now is actually rejection's not going to work, because, you know, this is happening before our eyes. And people on the streets now, say in Britain, are busy buying Chinese electric vehicles and saying how good they are and what good value are, and, well, you know, China's doing well and so on. So I think there's a sort of element of positivity creeping in, even though I don't think it's by any means the dominant feeling.
And Joseph, what do you think? What do you think will be the lasting impression around the world after this extraordinary week?
Well, to be completely candid, I'm rather optimistic. To be sure, I return repeatedly. I will be the first to admit that I return repeatedly to Antonio Gramsci's prison mantra: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And what I can say right now is this week, the will is winning.
Could I just add
Yes, you
to
can.
Joseph's remark about Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist, which is another well-known quote, is something to the effect that the old order is dying and the new one is not yet born. But actually, I think we're a bit further on than that.
To wait and see. Martin Jacques, Josef Gregory Mahoney, pleasure to have both of you on the programme. Thank you. Alongside the world leaders, invitations to this week's parade in Beijing were extended to many of those who work to promote better relations with China. One such is Zoe Reid, Chair Emerita of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, and she joins me now from Beijing. We've seen the pictures. The parade looked pretty jaw-dropping. What was it like for you?
It was completely phenomenal. And we were sitting parallel with, in the permanent seating, so parallel with where Xi Jinping was sitting and all the main political leaders, but a few blocks on. So everything that came up to go past him and the political leaders then came on past us. And we were in a stand which was mainly full of local people. And there was a few foreigners in one bit of it, and it just became, it mounted as everything got bigger and bigger. And the young guy sitting next to me was explaining, these have got no drivers. These are controlled elsewhere. So these go under the sea, and these go, in boats on the sea.
Let's talk about the image of China that this projects. Is it a military power? Is it a promoter of peace?
So I've been reflecting, why on earth, given that China talks about not being a warring country, it maintains peace, believes in peace, why it's done this. And I think what I started to think about was, in Britain, we have not had the experience of being invaded for 14 years. We've not had the experience of, pro rata losing the 36 million people that the Chinese people have lost through the fascist aggressors. And we've not had the experience, for example, of children being orphaned and hiding in the ditches during the day and then running to safety at night, which was the experience of my father. So it kind of made me think that if this was the backdrop to our life, we might think differently. We might behave differently if we felt we were under attack, under threat. And also, of course, we're an island in Britain, so I think we might think differently about how we manage our borders if we had, real physical borders across our country. So I think it was an attempt to show, peace through strength. We will hold the peace by showing our strength.
President Xi has rallied leaders of developing nations to advocate for a more equal, multipolar world and promote the correct historical perspective of World War II. What's your take on that?
Certainly I, as someone born and brought up in Britain in the 50s, 60s, 70s, had absolutely no idea that China was in the war or that China suffered the devastating aggressive losses that they did, or that it went on for so long. And I think that's one of the things that this has sort of opened my eyes to, and you know, made me realise the crucialness of understanding the history, what's happened to people, which then obviously shapes the way they respond to future situations. And so that's, I guess, what's going on there. There is a place for everybody in the world.
You're chair of SACU, an organisation designed to promote greater understanding between the UK and China. What are your biggest obstacles that you face in that endeavour?
Well, I was thinking about this question, and I do want to come back to my story at some point, but and I sort of thought maybe willful ignorance, this was last night when I was tossing and turning, is an obstacle. I mean, we hear, I think we've all got the message in Britain that China is one of the biggest polluters in the world, if you take the case of environment. But we're not hearing as strongly and fairly and importantly the phenomenal improvements and changes it's doing to overcome these environmental problems and pollutions that will eventually be of benefit for everybody in the world. So for SACU's point of view, that's thinking how we can even out the message is a real sort of obstacle and a real area for us to work on, I think. And certainly a focus on climate change and environment is something we want to focus on quite heavily over the coming period.
And what about opportunities? How do events like we've seen this week help to bring China and the rest of the world closer together?
Thinking about what will enable SACU to continue its mission in these new times with this new technology and these new ways of working, which is to build understanding amongst the British public that will then lead to greater tolerance and greater friendship between peoples of Britain and peoples of China. And so we're very keen, I think, to some of the connections we've made to get young people to understand the real China of today. So whilst there is value in talking about history, I'm not sure many of the young people today actually focus on war at all. It's not part of their frame of reference. So whilst we can tell the story, and we have been telling the story of George Hogg and others that are phenomenal, I think it is about what can we do to go to their place. So we're building this idea of perhaps getting young people to really know one of the phenomenal cities in China, perhaps Shanghai, its fashion scene. I gather it's got the most coffee shops in the world, the coffee shop scene, you know, getting young people to know the music of China, because we think that will help in the people-to-people work that SACU does.
Zoe Reid, thank you very much. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.